Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, before we begin, as always, please remember that I have begun a Patreon to help out this channel as well as the art that I do outside of this channel. There will be a link tree in the description section below. Please check it out, and if you've got a couple pennies this month that you don't mind parting with, throw a little bit in my hat, because everything that you do helps keep me, fed and helps me pay rent. And then also, eventually helps me buy comics, which is what this is about. So, $1 a month, that's all I'm asking for. Thank you a million times over. Now, I want to start by asking you a question. How often do you equate children's books with, say, Playboy magazine? Yeah, probably not at all. In fact, when you're reading a children's book, assuming you read children's books, Playboy is probably the very last thing on your radar, if at all. And yet today's video has a lot to do with children's books and a cartoonist whose work appeared predominantly in Playboy magazine. And that cartoonist is Shel Silverstein. And apparently Shel Silverstein, and I guarantee you my S's are going to destroy that. So apologies to your eardrums. If you're listening with headphones, I would definitely recommend toning it down. My speech impediment, S's, it's a thing. Anyway, Silverstein was a cartoonist who worked in Playboy for years, and I didn't know this until I was actually working at a library, and a youth services librarian mentioned to me that, Silverstein actually did commissions and illustrations for Playboys for years. Actually, for a bit before he actually made it big as a children's book author. Now, chances are, if you're watching this video, Silverstein has crossed your path in some form or capacity. Whether it be this book of poetry here, A Light in the Attic, one of the more popular books, of course, being Where the Sidewalk Ends, and then, of course, The Giving Tree, a book which I don't have in my personal possession right now because, one, the only copy I have is at my mother's house, and then two, I honestly don't like that book that much. I'm sorry. I know that makes me a bad person, but you know what? No, it doesn't. That kid was a dick, and that tree gave, and gave, and gave, and gave, and that little shit didn't appreciate it. You know what? I'm getting off topic. The point is, Silverstein is today's focus. Now, I don't have, to date, any collection of his comics that appeared in Playboy. However, today's book is going to be about one of his books that probably you've gone your entire life without hearing about it. Lord knows that I had until a couple years ago when I stumbled across it at a half-price books. And that is Different Dances. Now, I don't know yet whether or not this video is going to be age-restricted or not. I really don't. I thought maybe I'll just try publishing it and see what happens, but then another part of me is like, well, there's nudity in this. And when I say this, no, there's nudity and sex, a lot of it in this book. So, again, the guy who wrote Ickle Me, Pickle Me, Tickle Me Too will be doing stuff like blowjobs and anal in this book. Yeah, we're in for some fun today, y'all. So, I don't know if this is age restricted or not. If it is, oh well, monetization, what's that? Check out the Patreon, please. Seriously, anything and everything will help me. But two, recognize that the focus of today's video is going to get a little graphic. But also, it's going to be really interesting because it's going to be another reminder that the medium of comics is not just superheroes in square panels basically punching bad guys over and over again. What I love about comics, what I love about this medium is it's so limitless in what you can do, how you can express yourself, and the way that you can represent humanity in these weird, bizarre, and eccentric ways. So, let's hop into Different Dances, and let's talk about why Silverstein is a really, really interesting cartoonist. Alright, so, just a reminder again, if, nudity is not your thing, you're probably going to want to stop this video. Seriously, go check it out. At the time of this taping, ContraPoints just recently put out a new video about envy, and it is perfection. Go check it out. Love you, Natalie. Anyway, we're going to be talking about people and nudity, but first and foremost, we're talking about comics. Now again, I'm also going to advise you, if you have not watched my series of videos about This book here, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, I'd recommend you pause this video and check out at the very least the first video, or at least watch a couple of them. Or if you don't want to sit down and watch, multiple half-hour long segments and want to read an amazing comic book, check this book out because one, it's important. Two, it's great. Three, it's one of the most amazing graphic novels I've ever read. And then four, it provides you a lot of great vocabulary to defend comics as a medium if you are the kind of person who has to do that on a regular basis, such as yours truly. But the TLDR version, before we begin, is really composed in this crappily, hastily printed out picture from one of the panels from this book, where Scott McCloud points out what is, at least in regards to this channel and hopefully any and all comic studies, a functional definition of what comics actually is. And you can see he says it right here. But I'm looking at it in mirror language, so I'm going to have to pull it back for a second. Say, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence. Now, that definition, again, is important because if you look at what a comic is, it's juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence. It's placing images, whether that be images of human beings, animals, organisms, structures, what have you, in a particular way. Now, this can be as a way to tell a story. It can be a way to sort of convey a mood or an emotion, or it can be in a way to sort of explore an idea. And so, right off the bat, we have to remember that when it comes to comics, what we're talking about is a medium that has largely been driven by economics. Again, when we think of comics, or most people's understanding of comics, it tends to be either superheroes or newspaper comic strips, the latter of which is very, very quickly becoming irrelevant as more and more news media is moving towards a digital format, leaving newspapers to slowly wither and die away. Now, hopefully we're wrong about that in long terms, but that's a different video for another time. What's important here is we're challenging what exactly a comic is through this definition. Because again, does a comic have to be, say, a book or a little small floppy with a bunch of people bouncing around inside of these squares and rectangles, maybe circles, what have you, conveying information and telling a story? Not really. And that's why I really wanted to talk about different dances, because I took the dust jacket off here because I'm going to be holding this book a lot. I wanted to talk about different dances because it really manages to explore comics in a way that doesn't feel like a comic, and yet I think there's a solid enough argument for it. Take, for instance, the short story, The Deadly Weapon. Now, forewarning, you're going to see a dick. Penis. So, you'll note, just from afar, this is what most of the book is going to look like. It's going to be a lot of mostly full-page illustrations. This book here, you're looking at about 8.5 by 11 inches in terms of the actual size of the book. It looks and feels kind of like a coffee table book, so it's a big book. But then if we look at the story here, we see a man holding what appears to be his penis. He sees a woman walking by. He goes, "Ha ha, I will throw my penis at you, woman." And she's like, "Eek, no, don't do that." And then it lands. And then she's like, "Huh, wait a second." And the man's sense of triumph and victory is very quickly unraveled as he observes her grabbing it herself and throwing it back, in which case he's like, no, oh God, no, why? And then we get this beautiful long page ad of him wrapped up in his own penis while she carries him along. Different dances, everybody. Yes, okay, so what exactly was this? It was a story, yes, but one of the interesting things about Different Dances as a book is it's far more often than not basically kind of telling a series of jokes, but then also kind of briefly philosophizing about the human condition. I don't want to say that these are kind of like didactic moral fairy tales or something like Aesop's Fables where there's a story and you're supposed to glean something from it at the end, because sometimes there doesn't really seem to be any point to any of this. It's really more just about play. But let's take a look again at this, because you'll note we have this box that sort of outlines or centers these figures within the big open space of the page. As this man is throwing the penis across the page, we understand that time and space has moved. We have, at this moment, juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence. This is a comic. Whether some people would like to acknowledge it or not, I believe, and I will stand by this, that this book is a series of comics delivering fun, sometimes random, sometimes sad information to the viewer. Let's take another example. The story of Would You Still Love Me? Now, trigger warning, boyfriends, you've been here before. So, we have here a woman speaking to a figure who's just off the screen. Would you still love me? Yes. She cuts off her hair. Boyfriend says yes. She cuts part of her cheek open. Boyfriend says yes. She cuts off her breasts. What does the boyfriend say? I'll give you a hint. It begins with Y. It rhymes with guess. He says yes. So then she begins to trim. And he says yes. And then she cuts off her head and he says no. To which she responds, I knew it. Now, we'll get into the complexities inherent of human relationships and the way that, men and women exchange dialogue, understand each other's values, and okay, whatever. We have this moment where we're sort of exploring a relationship dynamic, and anybody who's ever been in a relationship, male or female, intersex, what have you, has probably had a moment like this. It may not have been this severe, but you've probably had a moment where your partner, or perhaps you were asking your partner, would you still love me or would you still be attracted to me under a new set of conditions or circumstances? So in this way, Shel Silverstein, through the Would You Still Love Me, is trying to just tell a small story that's very much rooted in real life, but you'll note again, he moves it into such hyperbolic perspectives that there's no way anybody would ever believe this. Of course, nobody would love you if you eviscerated yourself and cut off your own head. You'd be dead. So the hyperbole here is really more just sort of trying to make the reader laugh and go, ha ha, yeah, I've been in those conversations before. But formally speaking, what is he doing here? Again, we have the image of this woman who's basically just slowly destroying herself. But really take a step back and look at the layout of this page. Again, this is an 8.5 by 11 size piece of paper, and it's composed of nothing but black and white images. This woman here is written and illustrated in a very iconic style. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, again, go read Understanding Comics because Scott McCloud breaks that down for you. One of the general notions of an iconic shot is that when we look at art, the more complex a figure is, the less we ourselves can imprint upon it. If I look at a photograph of my dad, there's no way I'm going to look at the photo and think to myself, oh, that's me. I may recognize the smile he gave me because of his genes. I may recognize certain facial features or body styles, what have you, but I still recognize him as an other person. Whereas, if I look at, say, that little smiley face, or really not smiley face, I recognize that that's human because my brain and my eyes are, words. I look at that face and recognize that resembles a human being, but I could be that human being because it's so basic, so simple. So when we look at different dances as a book, it's important to recognize that often Shel Silverstein is creating a lot of very basic, almost iconic figures. So if we look at, say, territorial rights, this brief story here, a man is sucking on his girlfriend or wife's bosom, and then suddenly her belly starts to swell up, and then it's still swelling up, and then somebody punches him in the stomach, and now the baby gets to suck while husband gets to look on rather frustrated. So again, formally speaking, what's taking place here? Well, again, we're looking at a very hyperbolic situation. Obviously, in a literal sense, no baby is going to punch their dad out of the way to get to their mother's breast, but this is exploring a fundamental notion of kind of the Oedipus complex that was argued by Freud, which is the relationship that takes place between, say, babies and their mothers sort of assumes a quasi-romantic perspective. Now, again, this is a severe, and I really want to emphasize this, this is a basic reading of Freud. Go out there, find somebody that can give a much more complex example. But when we look at human relationships, before a baby appears, sexuality can be the foremost crux of a relationship. When you're with your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your non-gender specific partner, what have you, sexuality can really dominate the entirety of the relationships, whether you're cognizant of it or not. But with the introduction of a child, priorities begin to change, and sex doesn't disappear, because sex is one of the things that holds up a relationship and helps it last. But the child assumes priority, which means certain individuals within the party then have to abandon the things that brought them a lot of joy, and they have to find a new sort of space and place in the relationship. But again, he's doing this through a very iconic perspective. If we look at these figures here, we note that we have some presentation of gender. We recognize that this figure is female presenting. They're probably a woman. This figure is probably man. He seems to be male presenting. After that, though, because they are so simply drawn, because they are so simply rendered, and also I apologize for the lighting. I'm working off of an iPhone 8, y'all. Thank you as always for being so kind and patient and not pointing out how awful these videos sometimes look. Anyway, we're able to convey, or at least present ourselves, or excuse me, we're able to present ourselves onto these characters if we are the man, if we are the woman. But then after that, there's a lot of free and open space to actually just be. Now, I don't want to do just those instances of sexuality in the book, because he also gets into some gay shit, so let's talk about that. So, one of my favorite stories is Giving Birth. We see, by the looks of it, two male-presenting figures, again, represented very iconically. So, if we're men, we can imprint ourselves upon these characters. Now, ultimately, then, we see a frank and honest depiction of anal sex taking place between two cisgender men, but something begins to happen. The partner who is receiving, bottom, it's the bottom, okay? The bottom's back begins to swell up. It's almost as if he is becoming pregnant. But then something begins to come out of him. Also, why has nobody used this in a horror movie yet? Seriously, there is a gay horror movie out there in which one guy gets people pregnant with his sperm and it gives birth to something. I don't know. Hollywood, gay Hollywood, get on this shit. Come on. It writes itself. But what comes out of the boyfriend? An accusing hand, in which case the two lovers embrace, terrified and just horrified at what has happened. If you are gay or queer, you know that pointing gesture intimately, because this is not a literal hand. I mean, in the story, it's literally a hand that comes out and accuses them of something. But again, if we look at it, these two figures were happy and engaging, and then all of a sudden, the hand emerges from their act of sex. And you really don't need a PhD to understand that this is basically an examination of homophobia in a nutshell. But what's really great about this, again, is how simple and basic it is. Again, by placing these figures within the square, by keeping them very iconic and basic like this, we're able to just go down the page, left to right, and observe the story taking place. You also begin to observe the way he uses the figures in the space. Because if you stop and look at these two men, we have them separated, and then they're joined here in the act of sex. If you're looking at this really close up, you sort of create arrows across the page in your mind, and it's fun then to sort of backtrack out and observe how these figures begin to work their way diagonally down the page. It's an interesting way of creating composition for the reader, so that even if you don't have the benefit of, say, square rectangular panels, you still have an idea of how you're supposed to move down the page. Now, it's important to note that all of the stories in this book are predominantly pantomime. So what exactly does that mean? Well, let's take a look. This one, a non-erotic example, is called The Disciple. Let's go through the story again real quick. We have this gentleman who's approaching a wise man who appears to be in meditation, and he's got what can only describe as a straw, and that's a specific tool. Handymen who are watching, if you're watching, please give me the name of that device. It's a drill, but it's a hand-operated one. It's got a particular name, and I can't remember of it. So please, please, please hop in the comment section down below and let me know, because I'm supremely ignorant about tools. I mean, I have a master's degree in English. If that doesn't scream out I've never been in a garage, I don't know what does. Anyway, we see this man approaching the wise man. He screws a hole into the wise man's head. A hole is made. He places the straw in, sucks in some of the color from the man's head, and you'll see now the wise man's head is partially drained while this man's body is partially full. What is the disciple? Well, this is a metaphor for, how you say, instruction, teaching. One of the hard facts of life is that no matter how much you teach somebody, you can never completely convey everything that you yourself have experienced over the course of your life. So anybody who comes after you is going to have to approach things from their own perspective, try to glean as much as they can from whatever, is available to them, but they're never going to learn everything. And that's hard. We hate that we can't transfer all of our knowledge onto the next generation, or we really can't convey all of our experience to somebody else, because no matter how clear we are, how excellent or acute we are in our just execution of delivery, no matter how much we write down or how much space we fill on YouTube, we're never going to understand what it's like to be another human being, to feel what they feel, to think what they think, to know what they know. And so when we talk about a disciple, no matter how deep you drill and no matter how much you absorb, you're never going to completely get everything that was in the original lesson. Again, you'll note, by using the full pages, by completely stripping the page bare of panel arrangements and just showing these figures interacting in this blank space, these ideas and stories are just slowly coming at the reader. And one thing I also wanted to point out one of the things that I wanted to point out is that all of these stories are delivered to us via a pantomime narrative. Now, what exactly is a pantomime narrative? Well, I'm going to hopefully get to this in a later video. This small book here that I actually bought at Ground Zero the other day and I hope to do a video for is an example of a pantomime narrative. If you open up the book, there's nothing in the way of dialogue, or if there is, it's an unreadable dialogue. It's a science fiction story, fighter jets, people talking and yelling and stuff like that. But if we observe the actual story, we don't get anything in the way of recognizable dialogue. So what exactly is our reaction then to the story itself? Well, it's complicated, because even if you don't hear the sound of that drill going into the wise man's head, you can probably create it in your ear. Likewise, when he's sucking away at some of the wisdom. You can't hear the but you can picture it inside of your head. Pantomime narratives are narratives in comics, typically, and sometimes in film, and, well, you don't really get that so much in novels, but sometimes in film, sometimes in plays, what have you, you have physical actions that kind of force the reader to create their own sounds and thoughts. We talked about this a lot in Understanding Comics. Again, like I said, this book is important. When we talk about the notion of the gutter, you see this man has a hat, and then suddenly he takes it off. This space between the panels is where you, the reader, create the sensation of the man taking off his hat. You don't see it the way you would in a film or a video, because you have the benefit of multiple frames showing the removal of the hat. In comics, we don't have that. The medium doesn't work like that. It can, but for the most part, people like to simplify it down to, I don't see the detail of the hole being drilled. I don't see him approaching the wise man and then doing the drilling. I just see him seeing the wise man approaching with a drill and a straw, and then suddenly, pop, he's drilling. It's a little thing, but it's an important, because it shows again how these juxtaposed images are delivering information to the viewer and allowing us to create sounds and moments and impressions. I could keep going, but it looks like I'm about to hit the 20-minute mark, and I wanted this to be kind of a shorter video. All I can tell you about Different Dances is it's a strange, wonderful, crazy book, and I haven't even talked about all the weird, wonderful stories in here, such as the sperm, the egg, and the pill, or probably one of my favorites, The man who invented fire, the story of a caveman who discovers fire and then watches as his creation is effectively destroyed. This book, this collection is wonderful and it's amazing, and I'm really bummed that it took me as long as it did to finally discover it. So, really, if you want to see an interesting example of what comics can be, or a profoundly different example from all the other comics we've covered thus far, Different Dances is an excellent opportunity to look at the medium of comics and see how it can operate in a different fashion than what we're used to. And I find that really fun and really interesting. And one of the reasons why I love doing these videos is because it's a chance to take the examples that I know and kind of push them to the back to see somebody restructure the medium in a way that tells stories in a different fashion. It's not a long, drawn-out narrative, but it doesn't have to be. Because sometimes these little moments, these little impressions, can be so abstract and so weird and distinct, but sometimes in their seeming simplicity, it speaks to the depth of human experience. Yeah, let's do the last hurrah and then call it a day. Okay. Different Dances by Shel Silverstein. So right off the bat, I picked a lot of the really raunchy stories in this book. There are plenty of non-erotic stories. In fact, the book opens with a book titled The Bag Lady, which is just about a woman on the street digging through the trash, getting hassled by a police officer, and then the next thing that happens in one glorious shot, we see her summon a spell, zap the police officer into ash, tuck him into her bag, and go about her day. So please, if you do manage to track this book down, recognize this is not just Shel Silverstein doing a bunch of random dirty comics and stuff. There's also plenty of sort of, I don't want to say basic stories, no, non-sexual stories about the human experience. It gets into wanting and desire and sometimes just the unnecessary cruelty that people can inflict upon one another. What's great about Different Dances is, as the title suggests, there's so many different dances within. It's an attempt to just sort of take a bunch of slices of everyday life from humanity and just present it in a different way than we're usually used to, especially with the medium of comics. And then in terms of the medium of itself, Different Dances is a wonderful tool for anybody who makes comics to see that the typical panel layout that most people associate is not the only way of conveying information. It's not the only way of telling stories. It's not the only way to explore ideas. And hopefully in the future, I'll get to some more nonfiction graphic novels, which have sort of done the latter by exploring ideas through a kind of non-panel format. But I love this book. I love Shel Silverstein. I love his sense of play. And so if you like comics, if you like Silverstein, if you just love books, period, check out Different Dances, because it'll be one of the weirdest things you've ever read, but I guarantee you, at the very least, it will give you a couple of chuckles along the way. All right. I think I'm going to call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching. Holy cow, this video turned out a lot longer than I thought it would be, but that's on brand for me at this point. Like I said at the start, please remember there is a Patreon for this channel. You'll find it in the description section below. There's a link tree. It takes you to my Patreon account where I have a $1 a month tier. That's it. $1 a month to help me out, keep me paying rent, keep me buying food, keep me buying markers so I can make my art, and keep me stacked up in comics so we can talk about it here on YouTube. Along with that, I just want to... There's the thought. It disappeared there. What have you. Where were we? Patreon? Well, let's get now to Different Dances. Where can you buy it? Well, it's going to be a little tricky because I doubt your local comic book shop is going to carry a copy of this book. The publisher is HarperCollins, which is a more traditional print media establishment. They'll publish things like biographies and romances and self-help books. So try your local comic book shop to see if they've got a copy of this book first. They probably won't, but you never know. Comic book shops are weird, wonderful places where you'll discover all sorts of things. And even if you don't leave with a copy of this book, you may wind up with something just as good. Now, if your comic shop doesn't have it, don't forget you live in a country, you live in a world with public libraries. Check out your local public library, see if they've got a copy, and if they don't, just ask for an interlibrary loan for them. They can get the book for you. And always, thank you a million times over for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.